Hello, hello, hello. Due entirely to the dismal state of our modern education system, the practice of slavery and Britain's involvement, both in terms of participation and abolition, are severely misunderstood. So, while some claim that Britain invented slavery, or that we were the most immoral in doing it, and that we should feel somewhat uniquely guilty for ever having been involved in it, the truth instead is that slavery would still be a mainstream legal practice if not for Britain. Now, those of you who have already been in this sphere for a while may remember a video by Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad, of the same title. Whilst that video seems to have been removed by Carl, you can still watch it via many of the older reactions to it, for which I have included a playlist linked in the description below. Needless to say, many thanks and credit are due to Carl for his video, which I encourage you to watch. However, whilst Carl's video was an unabashed praise of Britain, my aim through this video is to provide a comprehensive, fair, and largely value-neutral analysis of slavery, especially as it related to Britain. Thus, in this video, I will talk about the universal reality of slavery throughout history, including the rationale behind it and the typical ways it manifested, slavery in Britain and the Empire, including the extent and rationale behind that, the British Crusade against slavery, including who led the campaigns, why, and to what extent this was a moral decision or a self-interested strategic decision, and then I'll give a few closing remarks. Lastly, before I get going, I know I'll have to repeat this throughout the video, but let me make it totally clear from the off that this is not an exercise in flag shagging. I will not be naively lauding the abolition effort as though there were not ulterior motives, because there quite clearly were. Nor when I talk about the attitudes of slaves or freedmen or talk about the history in any way should this be taken as approval or disapproval. I am merely presenting the context and facts as I understand them, regardless of how uncomfortable that may make some people. Anyway, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to it. Until relatively recently on the grand scale of human society, slavery existed in practically every corner of the world. With few exceptions, every organised human society in the past has been involved in slavery, from the Romans to the modern Arabs, and from the Aztecs to the medieval Japanese. Indeed, whilst the word slave has its roots in an 8th century Latin word for Slav, the actual practice is much older, with some academics even claiming it may have been a pre-human practice. This will come as no surprise, but slaves were kept chiefly for economic reasons, much like any other form of chattel. Even from the earliest days of human society, especially come the agricultural revolution, there has been a lot of grinding work that, whilst economically productive, is tedious and often unrewarding. But even if the work wasn't too difficult, it is, purely economically speaking, perfectly sound to obtain a slave to do that work for you in much the same way one might hire servants today. In, I dare say, the majority of cases, the limit to the amount of work that can be done was manpower. Thus, the more manpower you have, the better, and the lower the cost of labour, all the better still. Throughout history then, slaves were typically obtained in one of three ways: capture, birth, or trade. In much of the world, especially the more tribal regions, slavery was more about capture. In Africa, there were essentially two types of tribes: slaver tribes and slave tribes. The slaver tribes, who were stronger, held better positions, and had greater access to trade and resources, physically dominated weaker neighbouring tribes. These slaver tribes would periodically go on raids, overwhelming their neighbours, killing many of their men and taking many of them as captives, though leaving enough so that they would repopulate. These captives were then either kept for use within the slaver tribe or sold to other tribes or traders. When the British Empire demanded that King Gezo of the Dahomey Kingdom in modern-day Benin, West Africa, abolish slavery, he said, and I quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." This quote epitomises the attitude of West African slaver tribes. For them, it was not just about money or boosting the prosperity of their own people, but a deep, raw, innate need to subjugate one's fellow man. Though to modern Western ears this sounds so far removed from anything we might consider even thinkable, it was the norm in sub-Saharan Africa, and indeed much of the rest of the world. Then, it was from such tribes that many advanced civilizations got their slaves. Traders would travel to these tribal states, exchange goods such as food, weapons and resources for the tribe's slaves, then sell these slaves to the world's high societies for a worthy price. Though of course many of these advanced civilizations did capture slaves of their own, especially in ancient times, many of their slaves were purchased at market. Indeed, this was also true of the majority of slaves in later colonial European empires. The Europeans played the role of logistics and end consumer far more than producer. Though of course on the production front it should also be noted that many slaves were indeed born into that life to a slave mother. Generally speaking, these advanced civilizations were far kinder to their slaves than the tribes who first captured them, or indeed the traders who bought them and sold them. Whilst it would be nice to think that this is an artifact of some enlightened part of civilized cultures. Indeed, the typical plantation owner's attitude to his slaves is far less extreme than the attitude expressed by King Gezo of Dahomey, but it must also be mentioned that these civilizations had an incentive to be kind. Cruelty, regardless of its motive, inspires uncooperativeness, resentment, and revenge. For the ancient Roman landowner or Portuguese colonist whose slaves were there to serve an economic purpose, having unproductive or rebellious slaves would be very much against their self-interest. Contrarily, if he treats his slaves well enough that they feel little need to rebel against him, he is happy, they are productive, and they are kept content. Of course, discipline was often used and people were made examples of, but the typical treatment on a colonial European farm was generally far better than the treatment at the hands of tribal African rulers. To a large extent, it was ultimately a matter of self-interest. At the same time, I do not wish to dismiss the cultural element entirely. The Arabs, who had their slaves for much the same reasons, were infamously far crueler in their treatment than the Europeans, despite incentives being the same. Indeed, if we look at the treatment of pets, work animals, and livestock such as dogs, horses, and cattle, we can say still today that Western Europeans are far kinder to their animals than other cultures are. Again, despite incentives being the same. So there definitely was some cultural aspect to it too. And on that front, I will say that Europeans tended to be far less cruel than other cultures. Additionally, one must talk about why the slaves did not rebel. What incentives did they have to stay in line and not simply kill their master and make a run for it? Well, there are two parts to the answer: the carrot and the stick. On the positive side, the carrot, slavery usually offered a very stable life. People were born into, lived their whole lives in, and died in the exact same location, working for the exact same family. They had shelter guaranteed, food guaranteed, security guaranteed, healthcare usually taken care of. A duty of care was owed to them, and even in some societies such as that of Rome, a life of good service could lead to their freedom. Though I suspect in many cases this was because slaves who had grown old became more burdensome than productive. Contrarily, on the negative side, the stick, those who misbehaved would be punished, often harshly, and those who ran away or killed their masters would be made examples of in very cruel ways. Even if they could escape, many slaves had been transported immeasurably far from their homes, and any chance of reuniting with their families was out of the window. This was of course especially true of any slave shipped across an ocean. Besides, where would they run to? In many cases, nowhere was safe. They would simply be caught and sold back into slavery again. Unless there was a guaranteed safe haven and safe route of passage, such as British Canada and the Underground Railroad in the 19th century, escape was often simply not worth the risk. And with the mention of Canada and the context now adequately explained, it is time to talk about slavery within Britain and her empire. Slavery in ancient Britain, like all inhabited places, had existed for far longer than there was any memory or record. It existed before the Roman era, during the Roman era, after the Romans left, and all through the Viking Age. However, compared to many countries, slavery in England was also rather short-lived. In fact, it was in 1086 that King William the Conqueror decreed that any man caught trading slaves would have to pay the king a significant fine. The people weren't free in the way we moderns would understand it, but rather they were made into serfs instead of slaves. And indeed, after a couple of generations, slavery in England had all but died out. Now, the record hence seems a little confusing. King Henry VIII enacted a number of reforms that essentially ended feudal serfdom, and it appears that not long after that, during the Age of Exploration, some slaves were brought from Africa to England. Explorer John Locke, that's L-O-K, ancestor of philosopher John Locke, L-O-C-K-E, is said to have made a magnificent journey sailing to West Africa and back. He brought back with him many treasures and riches, including 5 black slaves, for exotic interest. so it's unclear whether slavery at this point was considered legal or not. In any case, in 1772, the legal status of slavery in Britain was clarified. In 1769, 3 years prior, a British-American slave owner, one Charles Stewart, had brought his slave James Somerset with him to England. However, in 1771, Mr. Somerset escaped, and after recapture, the matter was brought to court in 1772. Graciously, members of the public had crowdfunded significant money for Mr. Somerset so he could have proper legal representation, though the lawyers were quite happy to provide their service free of charge anyway. It was later proclaimed, though not by the presiding judge Lord Mansfield himself, that the air of England is too pure for a slave to breathe in. Thus, all who come to England must automatically not be slaves. The actual details of this case are a little muddier than Carl's portrayal in his video. Mansfield essentially stated that he did not believe slavery had ever been legalised positively in law, nor did he believe it had been prohibited. Indeed, thousands of people were de facto enslaved in England both before and after this case, with full knowledge of the public and the courts. People had claimed that merely being in England meant that you were free of slavery, or that being Christian meant you were free of slavery. However, Mansfield pointed out that nowhere in law was this stated as the case. And the quote about the purity of England's air is misattributed to Mansfield. It does not appear in any of the case's official records. In spite of this, the case was undeniably a massive boon for the growing abolitionist cause in Great Britain, and whilst the colonies had many slaves, the mother country itself was largely slave-free and with a strong abolitionist spirit, to which I will return later. Speaking of the colonies though, it's high time we took a look at the British Empire. The first slaves transported into the colonial British Empire were infamously done so in the colony of Jamestown in the year 1619. The demand for slaves at this point onwards was unsurprisingly due to there being a source of labour. For practically any colony, you have a situation where the European colonists were trying to set up and maintain rapidly growing settlements in lands that were entirely undeveloped. These settlements were incredibly profitable and of great economic value, but there was a lot of work to do, and the number of people to do it was without a doubt the most significant limiting factor. Slavery provided the solution to this problem. Now, for the Spanish and Portuguese, this was an easier task to solve. Most of their colonies were already relatively densely populated by the Native Americans, so the Iberians could, without too much difficulty, simply enslave the locals and jobs are good 'un. Though they did of course also ship over many African slaves to increase manpower further, as conditions were poor and mortality was high. In Britain's case, however, the situation was quite different. Though there were of course native people in North America, it was far less densely populated than South America. Besides, Britain, unlike Portugal and Spain at this time, saw native tribes as people whom they wanted to trade, not subjugate. Britain's control over the land in 1619 was vastly inferior to the Portuguese or Spanish control over their colonies, and Britain had neither the wealth nor resources to conquer and hold the lands as the conquistadors did in Latin America. So, a policy of relative cooperation with the natives was adopted. Much of Britain's colonial manpower then had to be imported, and West African slavery provided the best opportunity for this. Thus, as Britain's control over and settlement in North America increased, their policy became known as the Triangle Trade, wherein African slaves would be sent to America to produce raw materials to be sent to Britain, which in turn produced finished goods to be traded with African rulers for more slaves. I must say, whilst many would claim that the ordinary British people were thus culpable in this arrangement, the simple fact is that most Britons had no involvement in the slave trade whatsoever. Though they did buy imports from North America that had been produced by slaves, this is not materially or morally much different to the people who buy goods produced by modern slaves in the second and third worlds today, such as certain branded trainers or anything with cobalt from the Congo. Whilst you would be right to object to these practices, in terms of moral culpability, it's not as though your average John Smith in Worcestershire had any say in the matter, nor likely much knowledge of the details. Also, it bears note that, unlike the myth presented in shows such as Roots, which I might add was deliberately fabricated to create a myth of empowered slaves for black Americans, Europeans did not need to go hunting for Africans with giant nets. In fact, when they arrived at the shores of West Africa, they found that a flourishing slave trade had already been established there. As I mentioned earlier, it was strong African tribes subjugating and enslaving weaker African tribes. Undeniably, European demand encouraged African leaders to massively increase slave supply, but it must be noted that the West African slave trade was, all said, mostly Africans selling Africans. Anyway, the British involvement in the slave trade lasted for 188 years with a total of, depending on your source, 3.4 million slaves transported, a little over a quarter of all transatlantic slaves. Britain neither had the longest period of involvement nor the highest number. Both of those titles go instead to Portugal, which only abolished the slave trade in 1836, 29 years after Britain. It's also important to note that, whilst the West African slave trade is widely known about, there was also an East African slave trade, done primarily by Arabs and other Muslims, which began far earlier, lasted far longer, totaled more people, and was a lot crueler. Not to mention, there were also Barbary pirate slavers, Muslims from North Africa who raided the coast of Europe, capturing white Europeans to sell them into slavery to North African Muslims. In fact, America's first ever war as an independent nation was with Barbary pirates, who raided American merchant vessels. Whilst the West obviously talks about its own history of slavery more, these other slave trades undeniably need greater recognition. Anyway, I've put off talking about abolition for long enough now. It is now time to talk about this video's namesake. The whens, whos, hows and whys of the British Crusade against slavery. Though it would take until 1838 for the total abolition of slavery to come into effect across Britain's colonies, with the trade itself having been abolished 31 years earlier, the movement for abolition began far earlier still. Whilst Christianity's teachings on slavery seemed on some level to tacitly support the practice, it must be recognised that the earliest abolitionists were Quaker Christians, with English Quakers airing their first official disapproval in 1727. 60 years later, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded, after which British Member of Parliament William Wilberforce led the abolitionist cause in Westminster Palace. The Church of England too was a powerful force in the abolitionist effort, which makes its current prostrating over the matter seem all the more farcical. In any case, the abolitionists would see their first great success with the passing of the Slave Trade Act 1807. This abolished the slave trade throughout Britain's empire, punishable by a fine of £100 per slave found abroad, close to £8,000 in today's money. 4 years later, with the Slave Trade Felony Act 1811, involvement became punishable with imprisonment and, in 1827, death. To enforce this, Britain created a new detachment of the Royal Navy called the West Africa Squadron. This squadron was tasked with patrolling the entire West African coast and hunting down any ship which was carrying slave cargo. Between 1808 and 1860, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron seized approximately 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 African slaves. Britain also used its diplomatic, financial and naval might to pressure other nations into abolishing their slave trades and to permit the Royal Navy to search their merchant vessels. And Britain used nothing short of gunboat diplomacy to demand African rulers stop selling slaves, sometimes literally bombing them into submission, all for the abolitionist cause. Now I bet that's not something you were taught in school. However, whilst the trade of slaves had been outlawed and those who did transport slaves were hanged, slaves were still legal to own. Thus, in the 1820s, the abolitionist movement was rekindled. The Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions, known simply as the Anti-Slavery Society, was founded in 1823. This society campaigned against legacy slavery and pushed for its total abolition. Whilst Parliament recognised the strong abolitionist sentiment across the country, it knew it would not simply be enough to abolish slavery, lest its colonists openly rebel against it, American Civil War style. Thus, Parliament decided that the best course of action was to borrow £20 million, equivalent to £2.2 billion today, or 40% of the annual GDP of the time, to buy the freedom of all slaves within the empire, a loan that was being paid off right until 2015. Many people object to this, complaining that slave owners were given the money rather than the slaves. However, I will say that slave owners had owned their slaves legally, and their loss would cause great financial harm. Even in a case like this, I do not believe a government should be able to seize one's property without compensation. If the British government had tried to, there may have been open rebellion and thousands of lives lost. In any case, the abolitionists had won and the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 was passed, coming into effect in 1834. Then, whilst the initial plan was to keep slaves in 6-year indentured apprenticeships, successful campaign pressure meant that this period was shortened, and by the 1st of August 1838, every vestige of slavery was swept away in the British Empire. The abolition movement didn't stop there, of course. Instead, it essentially became the British project of the Victorian era. The might of the Royal Navy was used countless times to enforce the abolition of slavery across Africa, Oceania, Asia, South America, and indeed Europe. The shortest war ever, the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, was in part fought to enforce the abolition of slavery. Britain was the first and foremost power in the abolition effort, and I do not believe it's unfair to say that without Britain, slavery would still be both legal and mainstream in much of the world today. Now, some people claim that the abolition of slavery was also done because of a number of slave revolts, including most famously the Christmas Rebellion in 1831 in Jamaica. Whilst these revolts undoubtedly added more fuel to the abolitionist fire, my reading of the history is that the abolitionist movement would have succeeded even without these revolts, that many of these revolts only happened because the abolitionist movement was so strong and the promise of emancipation so likely, and that had the British regime wanted to keep slavery in place, it could have done so. This is not akin to the case of Haiti, where the slave revolt there ultimately did prove successful, at least in terms of freeing the slaves. Actually, there is something to mention that goes against the popular narrative of abolition, something even the left, who are often Britain's loudest critics, do not mention, and that's opposition from some slaves to abolition, or more precisely, freedmen regret. As I mentioned earlier in this video, there were a number of reasons why a slave might stay loyal to their master. Positive reasons, the carrot. Many freedmen continued to work on the same plantations even after abolition, as many of them simply knew nothing else. However, the relationship of employer to employee is naturally very different to that of slave to master. Things such as guaranteed food and shelter, healthcare, privileges, and stability were now no longer guaranteed. Freedmen now worked for a wage and would be expected to purchase their own food, pay for their own healthcare, and rent or buy their own shelter. It's not that they enjoyed being slaves, but rather that they disliked wage labour even more. Besides, it's the 1830s we're talking about. It's not like there was much in the way of education, improvement of skills, or major career changes. Indeed, because abolition meant that slave owners no longer had to provide for their slaves, this actually saved a lot of plantation owners money. As an important reminder, this is value-free analysis, so that you get a comprehensive view of the entire subject matter. This is not advocacy for any particular policy, nor should you assume any implication otherwise. Though you could take both the previous paragraph and the existence of slavery in the first place in the British Empire as indictments of capitalism, one would also have to recognise that it was the incentive structures of capitalism that enabled the Industrial Revolution, which itself meant that abolition was a feasible policy to begin with. Anyway, there is another reason for the abolition of the slave trade that I have yet to mention. A strategic reason, and a cynical power play. Whilst, as I said, industrialisation had made the abolition of slavery an economically feasible policy, the number of countries that had industrialised by the early 1800s was 1. Britain. And, while slave-produced goods like sugar and rum made up very little of the British economy even before abolition, slaves were far more important to the economy of Britain's rival, Spain. For the Spanish Empire, the mass import of slaves was still an absolute necessity as a source of manpower, without which the Spanish economy would seriously suffer. Thus, by taking its anti-slave trade stance, hunting down slave ships and freeing the slaves, Britain was depriving Spain of this much-needed source of men. Britain could both weaken her enemies and morally grandstand about it at the same time. And this logic was true across much of the rest of the world too. Slavery was obviously a good source of very cheap labour. By denying foreign artisans, farmers and the like of this labour source, Britain was also serving its own competitive interests. Imagine today going to China, Vietnam and Bangladesh and saying that their sweatshop workers will now have to be given safe working conditions, 40-hour work weeks, 30 days of holiday a year, minimum wage guarantees and employee protection legislation. These places wouldn't be able to cope. There'd be no chance that they'd be able to make their goods so cheap. They'd simply go bust. This is exactly what abolition was like for those people's ancestors all the way 2 centuries ago. Despite this, however, I do still believe Britain's crusade against slavery was still sincerely a moral undertaking driven by Christian doctrine. Just because something is in one's self-interest doesn't mean that it can't also be done for good reasons. Abolition came at a substantial cost to Britain in terms of finance, manpower, and diplomatic power. The people of the nation genuinely seemed inspired by and fervently in favour of the abolitionist effort. Besides, with all the missionary work done exposing the horrors of the practice and the testimonies of men like Dr. David Livingstone, it's hard not to see the British Crusade against slavery as morally pure. And so, I'd like to give a few closing remarks. It is thanks to the British and other Western efforts to abolish slavery that we modern people now recognise the practice to be morally abhorrent despite how commonplace it had been throughout history. As such, the anger felt towards it and against the descendants of those who partook in it is at some level entirely understandable. With that said, the record of history does, for anyone interested enough to look, show that everyone's ancestors were at some point both slaves and slave masters. However, whilst in my case those ancestors have long since mixed together, you have in America and other places in the world a case where the black population there was, until recent African immigration, clearly descended from slaves. Their recent ancestors were all victims, not perpetrators. Black Americans as an ethnic group are one clearly descended from slaves. Thus, it is easy to see why Americans view slavery as a black and white issue, not merely a universal human issue. Also, reality is rarely ideal and no government policy can magically create prosperity, at best only enabling its creation. So, whilst it would of course have been nicer for the slaves of the day to have been given compensation, the compromise we got seems to me to have been a good one. Whilst abolition was clearly not entirely selfless, I am nonetheless immensely glad that the British self-interest aligned with what is morally pure, as it has often done throughout history, and I am glad to be part of the few people on this planet to inherit this nation's legacy. I am very proud of Britain's crusade against slavery, and I believe Britons have much to be proud of. The abolitionist movement, though it took the best part of 2 centuries, was eventually achieved, and slavery was outlawed the whole world over. However, this victory now rings hollow. I lament to say that under the ever-moralising yet morally bankrupt American hegemony, slavery has been allowed to return in much of the world, and there are now open slave markets in Libya. We ought not stand for this. Anyway, thank you for watching this far through the video. This video has been in the works for quite a while, and I'm glad to have got it done. I hope I've done a good job, and I hope people will think that I've done a totally fair job. Again, do please watch Carl Benjamin's video of the same name. I'm glad though that this video can stand as a more honest assessment of Britain's role in slavery. If we only talk about the good, or only talk about the bad, people cannot make a fair assessment for themselves. This would be a great shame, I believe, as I think a fair assessment still is overwhelmingly in Britain's favour. Britain is the reason, more than anyone or anything else, that slavery was abolished globally, and nobody can take that away from us. Anyway, again, thank you for watching. If you like what I do and want to see more of it, then I have a Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description, and any donation there would go a long way. Also, the channel is fast approaching the thresholds for monetization, so I will be able to get cracking with member exclusive perks soon. Other than that, please like, subscribe, and God save the King.